speed today. As fundamental to the making of a candle as the wax is, so too is the wick that bears its flame. One might think this is a simple concept, but the many varied options available to us need to be discussed thoroughly to ensure that the correct choice is made when choosing how to wick your candle. The manner in which your candle performs will ultimately be affected by your wick choice. Considering that your scent throw, sooting, burn time, and how well the wick interacts with the fragrance additives, wax, container, and environment will all be reliant on this one seemingly simple choice. It's really a rather important one. Welcome to your professional diploma in candle making and lesson 5 of the first module of this course, Illuminating Wicks. During this lesson, we are going to be discussing the following objectives: listing the different wick options, calculating the correct wick size, and recognizing the appropriate wicks for different projects. As with every other decision you've been encouraged to investigate during previous lessons, we need to look at certain criteria that you'd like your wick to meet in order to make as informed a decision on your choice as possible. Some things you need to look out for are as follows: a flame size that burns consistently every time. You don't want the flame to be erratic in its size, growing bigger and smaller every time you light your candle. Flames that are larger than they need to be will cause the wax to melt faster than it should and create a candle that doesn't live up to its ideal burn time. A short flame will just extinguish itself again and again and never allow an adequate burn pool to form. We also want as little mushrooming as possible. As discussed in previous lessons, mushrooming is an undesirable characteristic occurring in a wick and can cause your candle to malfunction. It only occurs in our cotton wicks, so when choosing one of these variants, we need to make an educated decision on how to limit the potential of this occurring in a candle. We want to maintain the temperature of the container so that it doesn't become too hot to touch or so hot that it breaks. It's normal that any container that holds a candle will warm slightly when the candle is lit, but it should never reach a temperature that makes it impossible to handle or move. Your wick choice will be a major factor in controlling this. We also require an adequate wax pool for the size of the candle. This is another topic we've touched on before. The melt pool of your candle, namely the melted wax surrounding the flame, should reach a very specific diameter dependent on the candle. The wick you choose will control the size of your melt pool and ultimately the burn quality of your candle. We also want as little afterglow as possible. Afterglow, which we've also already discussed, is the light that remains in the candle wick after the flame has been extinguished. This isn't as big of a flaw as something like mushrooming or an incorrect melt pool, but it is something we'd like to pay attention to preventing as far as possible. Becoming familiar with all of these criteria can only be achieved by your testing and experimenting with the different options, so the actual experience is crucial here. As many guidelines as I give you, you will need to double-check yourself time and again by inspecting your experiments and paying attention to their correctness and anomalies. The wick is the element of the candle that upholds the flame on one end and grounds into the wax below to allow for the sucking of the molten wax upwards to feed and fuel the flame, thereby keeping it burning. While this concept alone is fairly simple, the choice of the wick is less so, because it takes into account how to engineer many more factors than this mere action. Depending on the viscosity of the wax, the size of the candle, the additives in the candle, the container or lack thereof, our wick choice has to consider all of these variables. Should we make an incorrect wicking decision, it's important to note that we'll most likely end up with a malfunctioning candle. This might look like wax perhaps not being pulled up to the flame, or in quantities larger than what it should be. It could also result in not enough wax being pulled up towards the flame, or even a clogged transition between the lower end of the candle and the flame. Another difficulty in wicking also comes in when we notice that for every different wick type, there are a variety of sizes for each of these. This causes an exponential increase in the number of wicks to be taken into account when deciding on the best one to use in your candle. We'll begin our lesson by exploring the different wicking options. Firstly, we're going to look at flat braid wicks and what exactly they are. Flat braid wicks are the first within the category of the different cotton candle wicking options. The name of the wick is taken from its composition. The wick is created by tightly plaiting or braiding 3 separate strands of cotton thread, as one would with hair, to create a combined thread bundle that is flat. What is done to increase the size of the wick is that more fibers or threads are added in multiples of 3 before braiding it, thereby increasing the size but maintaining the flat appearance. We refer to the wicks according to the number of threads that have been included in the braid. The number of threads being used is known as ply, like with toilet paper. The amount of ply is how many threads have been included in the making. Flat braid wicks will demonstrate a curling phenomenon that helps the candle in trimming its own wick. This isn't to say you shouldn't check your wick to see if it needs manual trimming, but what this curl creates is a scenario whereby the wick burns and then folds back down and back into the flame. The parts that have already burnt will fall off the remaining wick and can be removed from the wax. This special phenomenon also helps in the prevention of mushrooming of the wick. We generally see this type of wick being used in the creation of freestanding candles like pillars and tapers. Something of interest is wick priming, which we covered briefly in our lesson about candle terminology. The term refers to the wick undergoing a process of being dipped in an oil or wax. Most people think this makes the wick more flammable or easy to burn, but this is not the truth behind this strategy. The reason this is actually done is that when cotton wicks are woven and braided, no matter how tightly this is done, there will still be a certain amount of air remaining between the strands. Immersing the wick in oil will fill all these gaps and drive out the last of the air trapped inside them. This means the wick will burn at a slower rate as it isn't consuming excessive air. Next, we'll look at square braid wicks and what they are. A square braid wick is also a bleached cotton wick like its smaller flat braid cousin. The braiding technique used to create this, however, is different in that it creates a more sturdy shape from the cotton. It will also have undergone a treatment process to allow for its use in high viscosity waxes. The alternative structure of the wick makes it better suited to waxes that have a high viscosity, such as beeswax and vegetable waxes like soy and coconut. In fact, they were originally created for use in beeswax candles. The alternative structure also allows the wick a sturdier stance, which in turn makes it possible for the cotton to remain upright, unaided, in the center of the melt pool it creates. This way, it doesn't fall sideways and change the melting structure of your candle while it burns. Something interesting to note is that while it is called a square braid, the appearance of the wick is in fact round. Owing to their thicker nature, they are good for use in candles with a wide diameter where more heat needs to be generated to create a larger burn pool. With this larger burn pool comes the possibility of the wick falling sideways within the molten wax, and again portrays the necessity for the sturdier wick structure which won't fall over. Additionally, they have a similar burn structure to the flat braid wicks in that they curl as they burn. This curling allows the burnt portion of the wick to fall back into the flame and be burnt off. A great plus when one is looking at ways to help prevent mushrooming. It's also important to mention for both of the wick types spoken about above, many companies and stockists will have different ways of indicating the difference in the size of these wicks. Knowing how to choose the correct wick size for the diameter of the candle you wish to make will depend on their system and various naming and numbering formats their sizes appear in. Now we'll look at our core wicks and what they are. Our third cotton wicking option is the cord wick. There are various kinds of cores that can be used with the cotton braiding, namely a cotton core, a paper core, and a zinc core. What these add is a rigid structure in the center of the wick around which the cotton is tightly bound. This gives us two additional benefits. Firstly, the rigid center makes for an even sturdier and more upright wick than the square braid. This helps our wick to remain upright and not collapse into the melt pool and extinguish itself, or fall sideways and affect future burns. The second benefit, or characteristic depending on how you look at it, is that this core allows variations of how hot the wick will burn. In terms of strength and rigidity, this is how we categorize them from highest to lowest. First is zinc, then paper, then cotton. However, in terms of higher heat, we have cotton as burning the hottest, paper following that, and zinc being the coolest burn. It's also important to note that zinc core wicks don't do terribly well in viscous waxes and should generally be used in paraffin. As we understand from previous lessons, the hotter the wick burns, the more wax it has the ability to melt, and the larger the melt pool it can achieve. This is always especially important to consider in our wider diameter candles, like pillars and large vessel candles. Most commonly used in the more petite jars with smaller candles are the zinc core wicks. They burn at a much cooler temperature than other wicks, which is why they work great to not overwhelm small containers and candles with a lesser diameter. Did you know it was common practice to use lead cores in candle wicks for a very long time? Fortunately, this is no longer prevalent following tests done to show the dangers of lead poisoning. It is, however, important to make double and triply sure that your metal core wicks do not carry any lead. An easy way to test this for yourself is to rub a wick that has not yet been lit with a white piece of paper. Should there be a grey smudge remaining, you can be sure there is lead in the wick. In this instance, discard the candle immediately. Lead poisoning is especially dangerous to babies and children and can lead to serious side effects. Lastly, we're going to be taking a look at wooden wicks and what exactly these are. This wick type is the new kid on the block and something of a novelty. It can be divided into two categories, namely hardwood wicks and softwood wicks. Depending on who you ask, the softwood wicks seem to be the reigning favorite, owing to their unique ability to create fire sounds. A series of pops and crackles that resemble the noises of a campfire. Understandably, this gives additional value to the candle because the psychological and emotional benefits of the item are far greater with the inclusion of this audible characteristic. Something to note about the wooden wick is that it forms its burn pool relatively quickly, and definitely more so than cotton wicks. This shortens the delivery time on scent throw because a quickly formed melt pool will allow the fragrance to be released in a more rapid manner. The greater surface area of the wooden wick also allows more fragrance to be pulled up from the wax below, and more area for saturation of that fragrance in the wick. It's important to note, however, that one should avoid using too much fragrance oil or other additives to a candle containing a softwood wick. The wick's ability to crackle is linked closely to using a well-calculated quantity of such additives, and overuse can result in the wick becoming overwhelmed or oversaturated. Another important point to note is that mushrooming can't occur on a wooden wick, as it isn't a cotton product. It will, however, become ashy from time to time and need to be trimmed in the same manner as a cotton wick. But the clumps of carbon associated with mushrooming aren't able to be formed. We don't commonly see wooden wicks associated with pillar or votive candles, the pillar being a freestanding candle and the votive being too small to accommodate the size and therefore heat of a wooden wick. We associate them most commonly with use within a container of sorts, although they can easily be used with natural or chemical waxes. A signature trait of the wooden wick is that it gives off a magical crackling sound, much like a campfire. Some candle makers use this type of wick specifically for this property, although the strength or amplitude of the crackle isn't consistent in all types of candle. So what creates this highly sought-after crackle, you may ask? Well, as with most things candle, it comes down to the science. During the production of a wooden wick, a process is performed on the wood to reduce the amount of vapor that is part of its makeup, lessening the moisture to make sure the wood will be dry enough to burn. However, as this happens, small water-filled pockets are created and essentially trap the liquid inside the wood. Once the wick has been lit and the whole area starts heating up, that trapped water is also heated and creeps up towards its boiling point. As with the kettle, water that reaches boiling point will build up to becoming steam. Being confined to the fragile wooden pockets, however, means the steam ultimately runs out of space and will begin to press against the confines within the wood. The force of this causes the wood to lose strength and capsize. The steam that then escapes catches against the flame as it bursts its confines and makes a pop, crackle, and tiny surge of flame. Something good to know, though, is that soy wax can actually inhibit this process and minimize any crackling. The oiliness of soy wax softens the whole process occurring within the wood and reduces any crackling noise that may occur. Similarly, by adding too much fragrance additive to your candle, you can also greatly reduce the crackling sound. The reason is the same as with the use of soy wax. Oily substances will just naturally soften the combustion process. So if the crackling sound is your primary focus, it's a good idea to choose an alternative wax to accompany this wick choice. Some companies, and the one we'll be looking at specifically today, have built their entire brand around the crackling wick of their candle. Beeswax Candles are an American brand created in Virginia. The byline of their brand is "Crackles as it burns," which immediately draws their customers' attention to their most notable feature, the crackling wooden wick. Their candles are also fragranced, but so are many brands of candles. So focusing on this additional sensory inclusion helps to set them apart from their competitors. They combine the aesthetic and auditory feature of the wooden wick, as well as fine fragrances and beautiful design. Ultimately, a recipe for success and one that sets the standard for all other similar products. We've chatted a lot about smoking of wicks and afterglow, but have you ever noticed that when you extinguish a candle by blowing it out, sometimes it can smoke for a while and fill the room with a horrid burnt smell? This is because blowing out a candle is in fact the incorrect way to extinguish it, something a connoisseur would never do. When we blow out a candle, we're in fact adding air and a variety of gases to the flame. This isn't to say that it doesn't get the job done, however. It simply isn't the ideal way to do it. What one should actually be doing when you extinguish a candle is to deprive it of air, not introduce more into the area of the flame. There are multiple ways to achieve this, but the most elegant would be the use of a candle snuffer. A dome-shaped instrument attached to a stick which you can hold. Lowering this dome-shaped structure gently over the flame starves it of the oxygen it requires to survive and extinguishes it without creating smoke or an unpleasant scent. I remember seeing these candle snuffers online some years ago and thinking they were frivolous decor accessories. It's only recently that I discovered that they had such a functional and well thought out purpose. I'm surprised this information isn't more widely publicized. If you can't find one of these in the shops and would like to test the effectiveness of its ability to prevent candles from smoking when put out, you could always fashion your own one out of tinfoil. It's an easy enough shape to achieve and a simple way to test the science for yourself. We'll now move on to our next topic. One of the most important calculations you'll need to do when making your candles is to learn how to discern the correct wick size for the project. To do this, we need to speak about how to determine the diameter of your candle or its container. The measurements in this section are where many candle makers fall short. To achieve a candle that burns reliably with a consistent flame and a melt pool size, these calculations will be of utmost importance. The majority of stores selling candle making supplies will have some form of guide available to you to aid you in your wicking process. Before purchasing wicks for your candle, you will need to measure the inside diameter of your container or the maximum diameter of your mold. Once you have this measurement, you will consult the wicking guide of the store you plan to purchase from. The wicking guide should appear as a chart indicating the different sizing possibilities down the left-hand side. Find the correct width of your container or mold on this chart, and looking to the right, choose the corresponding recommendation. Every different type of wick will have a different number or size indicator. So for instance, a size 14 in a cotton wick is not related to a size 14 in a wooden wick or a zinc core wick. Each type of wick has its own sizing scale. Please note that the chart I'm using in this lesson is just an example of how to read this information, and the numbers do not relate to the wick sizing specifications of any particular company. Each supplier will have their own version and sizing of this. These different types of wicks should appear along the top of the chart from left to right and line up with the size of the container. What some companies may even do is also make recommendations for when it would be appropriate to use more than one wick to achieve the correct burn pool for the diameter. The sizes will, however, always be an indicator of an increase in the width of the wick as the numbers ascend. The thicker the wick, the more material is being burnt. The hotter the wick will burn, and the more capacity it has to burn the wax. The more wax being burnt, the larger the melt pool, which is why bigger containers or candles with a larger circumference will have a larger number. It is important to note, however, that these sizing charts and guides are an indicator but not a guarantee that your wick size will be the right one. It is always important to factor in time and budget to conduct burn tests, which we will be speaking about in depth at a later stage in this course, to ascertain whether or not your candle has been correctly wicked. Upon conducting these burn tests, you will be able to know how the melt pool has formed and how the flame behaves, both of which can be an indicator of how your candle is performing. If, for instance, you have an excessively large melt pool, you will know that you need to decrease your wick by a size or two. If you have a candle with a very small melt pool, then you'll know immediately that your wick was too small and that you need to increase it in size. Let me show you the practical application of this. This vessel is the one I intend to use to make a container candle. As you can see, the inside diameter measures 85 millimeters. Now that I know this, I will go onto the website of the company from which I'm going to make my purchase to check their sizing guide. I've made up this dummy guide to show you the options. Since my container measures 85 millimeters, I will find the grouping that this number falls into on the chart, and then view all the options to the right of it so that I know which wick size in which category of wick will work for a candle of the size I intend making. This brings us to our next section, on which wick is appropriate for the type of wax you are using to make a specific candle. Let's also please note that certain candles like rolled beeswax taper candles and dipped taper candles are accepted as having a standard wick size, owing to the general consistency of making these types of candles. Let's now discuss how the wax that you will use will influence your wick choice. The zinc core wicks burn at a relatively cooler temperature than some of their cotton counterparts. Smaller candles like votives and tea lights would benefit from a wick like this so that their containers don't overheat and their wax pools don't become too large and overflow. It's a nice rigid option to make sure the wick doesn't fall sideways and extinguish itself, and it can heat paraffin wax, which has a lower melting point, quite adequately. This lower temperature, however, dictates that they won't be a good fit for our vegetable and natural waxes, which require a higher temperature to attain their melt point. Paper core wicks behave very similarly, and can also be used in smaller container candles such as votives and tea lights. They burn hotter than zinc core wicks, but still not at a temperature that would be adequate for anything other than paraffin wax candles. Square braided wicks are more loosely bound than their zinc core and paper core counterparts, allowing more air to circulate through their structure and encourage a bigger, hotter burn. Initially, these wicks were designed to be used in beeswax candles because this type of wax was far more viscous than paraffin wax. Viscous describes the thicker, stickier makeup of this wax. Because of the viscosity, beeswax required a wick that had an easier pull of the thick wax to transport it to the flame and burnt hotter to accommodate the higher melting point. The structure of this wick, however, makes it ideal to use in vegetable waxes too. Their higher viscosity requires the same treatment as beeswax. Paraffin wax, however, which is thinner and more easily transported, would not be a good pairing with this wick. The molten wax would move too quickly and result in the candle burning down faster than is necessary. The flat braid wicks are generally accepted to be ideal for use in tapers and pillar candles, as well as other molded candles. They hold very well for being dipped and used by candle making machines and have a good longevity. Since softer waxes like our vegetable waxes aren't generally used for dipping methods, this wick would then be ideally suited to paraffin wax candles. Wooden wicks were initially designed specifically for use with the newer vegetable waxes, but it isn't uncommon to use them with paraffin wax too. Owing to the high viscosity of your coconut, soy, and other vegetable waxes, a larger surface area for the wicks' capillary action was necessary. Besides which, they just look cool. Another great benefit of this type of wick is that it's an excellent carrier for fragrances in candles and offers a larger surface area to diffuse the scent into the air. They don't work terribly well in freestanding candles like pillars though. Since vegetable waxes are generally used in container candles owing to their softer structure, and since wooden wicks were designed specifically for our vegetable waxes, it stands to reason that wooden wicks will most commonly be used in container candles. Another characteristic to note about the wooden wick is that it burns at a slower rate and almost smolders. This allows candles to burn for far longer than they might if a cotton wick was used instead. Regardless of the wick you choose and the type of candle you wish to make, conducting burn tests to check the quality of your wick is always a necessity. This is something we'll speak about more in future lessons. With so many variables involved, including the environmental ones where your candle is produced, your outcomes will vary to a degree, and your only way to know that a candle has in fact been correctly wicked is to do your own testing. Let's take a look at some of the additional factors influencing the wick size choice. Have you ever considered that the addition of fragrance or color dye might affect your wick choice? It definitely will. Another important consideration in choosing a wick are the additives that you will be using. As we spoke about earlier, our wick is a vehicle from the wax at the base to the flame at the top, and this vehicle is what is transporting the fuel to the flame. This process is referred to as capillary action. Capillary action is the ability of liquid to flow in narrow spaces without the assistance of or even in opposition to external forces like gravity. For instance, this sugar cube sitting in colored water draws the liquid up into itself using nothing more than the fact that there are gaps of air with the ability to be filled. No force is exerted. It merely moves into the available space. A wick performs the same function by drawing the wax up into itself using the same unaided transfer of liquid. The comparison between vegetable and paraffin wax is also a consideration that needs attention. Paraffin wax has a lower melting point than vegetable waxes, which require a hotter flame to reach their melt point. The size of the wick is therefore important to this, as something like soy wax, which falls into the vegetable wax category, will need a wax that is one size larger than a paraffin candle of the same diameter. We've already covered so much information today. Let's take a moment to rest our minds before we continue with this exciting lesson. And while we do that, I'll introduce Lesson 6 to you. In our next session together, we're going to be looking into all the requirements and options encompassed in setting up a home candle making station. Your first workshop setup for the new hobby and career you're currently building knowledge on. So don't forget to attend your 6th class to keep expanding on the skills you've already obtained today and in our past lessons. Our last section in this lesson is how to recognize the appropriate wicks for projects. Let's begin by looking at tabbed wicks. In days gone by, wicking was bought in bundles and rolls. You would then cut your own lengths to use in the creation of candles. This is still very widely done, but we do now have another option available to us. Wick companies are offering pre-cut wicks in a variety of standard sizes. A great benefit of these is that you can buy them tabbed. Tabbing refers to the attachment of a metal sustainer at one end of the wick and allows a stable surface to glue to the bottom of a container. The sustainer is both the means of attaching the wick to the container and also the way in which it is forced to stay centered inside a vessel as the candle burns downwards. Price consideration and budget will also have an impact. One of the biggest deciding factors in whether to use wooden or cotton wicks will undoubtedly be the price. Generally speaking, wooden wicks cost almost double what their cotton counterparts do, depending on your supplier. If you are looking to improve the fragrance throw of a scented candle, it can be argued that the higher price of the wooden wick, especially in combination with a vegetable wax like soy, will be worth it for a better experience in burning the candle. If you are making the decision based solely on the aesthetics of the wick, you will have to factor this higher price into your pricing. If making a specific candle, though, and maintaining a reasonable financial input is your goal, it would definitely be better to then stick with a cotton wicking option. We then need to consider the functional versus aesthetic of a candle wick. I think we can agree that all candles are aesthetic to a degree, even if their primary necessity is for the functional value of light. That being said, the correct wicking of the candle will affect the overall aesthetic value. A badly wicked candle, perhaps one that hasn't been trimmed to the right length, will burn with a large flame that flickers intermittently, shoots soot onto the surrounding surfaces, and emits vast amounts of black smoke from its flame. None of these outcomes will contribute to a pleasing aesthetic experience for the viewer of your candle. These same factors will also result in a poor functional value. A large discrepancy in the visual impact of a candle has however been introduced with the creation of the wooden wick. In the current Scandinavian minimalist raw wood trend we see so commonly, the presentation and the visual perception of the earthy, natural, bringing the outdoors inside type wick is an enormous draw card. We're all about incorporating nature into our homes these days with an abundance of plants and untreated wooden furniture. So it makes perfect sense that this wick option would be more desirable to such decorators than the common cotton options. However, as discussed before, not all candles can be made using a wooden wick. So depending on the type of candle required, this could be a limiting factor. We can't, however, differentiate between the functional light provided by a wooden or cotton wick. If the candle has been correctly wicked, regardless of the medium, then a good flame providing consistent light is part of that outcome. Our need to have an appropriate burn time for any given candle will dictate the kind of wick that can be used. As we've discussed in some of the previous sections, certain wicks burn hotter or cooler than one another. One way or another, we could probably use any wick in any type of candle, but this will absolutely affect the burn time and overall functionality of your candle. Sound knowledge of the traits of your wicking options is very important in choosing the correct one. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you perhaps wish to make something like a paraffin pillar candle, you know that your ideal wicking type for this is a flat braid wick. However, perhaps the store you're shopping at is out of stock and you have to make an alternative plan, like using a square braid wick. We know that square braid wicks are designed for more viscous wax and burn hotter and faster to accommodate this. However, it wouldn't be entirely outside of the realm of possibility to use one in a paraffin candle if you decided to use a smaller width wick than you would have been recommended for a beeswax candle of the same size. This would cause it to burn a little cooler and more slowly. While this isn't a perfect solution, it's a plan you could make to ensure that the desired burn time of your candle isn't compromised by not having the ideal wick available to you.